All right, so we are live, everyone. My name is Jesse, and I am with Exploring by the Seat of Your Pants. For those joining us for the first time, we are all about bringing conservation, adventure, and science into classrooms around the world. And of course, there are no classrooms right now. All of you guys are joining us at home on YouTube, so we really appreciate you joining us today. And oh, I got reverb. My own fault. There we go. Sorry about that. All of you guys are joining us here on YouTube today, so we really appreciate you tuning in as we continue to celebrate scientists, explorers, and amazing facilities from around the world. Today, we are joined in Ottawa, Ontario, Canada, our capital, by Peter Soroye, and he is a conservation biologist at the University of Ottawa who studies the intersection on climate change and habitat loss on pollinators, all these amazing insects and creatures that help keep our crops and plants around the world healthy. He tries to understand some of the things that we're doing to them to maybe affect that and make it a hard time for some of those amazing creatures. So today we're going to learn from Peter. Thank you so much for joining us today, and take it away.
Thank you. Thanks for having me. Let me share my screen here. How does that look? Good to go. All right. Yeah. Thanks for having me so much, Jesse. Thanks everyone for tuning in. Hope you're all well and healthy and safe. And I'm really excited to chat to all of you about climate change and pollinators and a little bit of how you can save the world, even starting right now today. So without any further ado, I'm going to jump in. Like Jesse said, my name is Peter Soroye. I'm a PhD student at the University of Ottawa, and this is me. So I'm a pretty regular dude. I've been doing my PhD for a while, and I've been at the University of Ottawa for a while. If you don't know where Ottawa is, if you're from Canada, hopefully you do. But if you're not, then it's a few hours north of Toronto. It's on this map here. It's a beautiful spot. It's kind of a temperate forest ecoregion. And it's a really great spot, really beautiful people. And so I've been here for a while doing my PhD. And at this point, it's been a long time that I've been in school, but it doesn't really feel like school. There's no tests, there's no exams. Instead, I do research. And so like any other scientist, I'll think of questions, I think of hypotheses of how things work, how the world works, how animals interact, and how climate change might throw things out of whack or change things in our ecosystems or with us humans. And I devise experiments to do these out and to test these ideas. And these experiments can be in the field or big data sets, but at the end of the day, it's kind of that basic of science of developing ideas and questions and figuring out experiments to test them. And so all this to say that, I'm a scientist and I really enjoy doing this, but I'm also a pretty regular person as well. So I enjoy sandwiches and basketball, go Raptors, even if the NBA season is canceled. That just makes us finals champions 2 years in a row. So that's great. I enjoy music. And more than all of these things, I enjoy this beautiful planet that we live on, this big blue and green planet, just full of wondrous things. And for me, this love of our planet started really early. I grew up camping with my family, with my grandparents. And so for me, being out in nature has always been a really great time, not only to connect with family, but to see all the really beautiful things outside and appreciate kind of the beauty and the diversity of nature and the different organisms in it, even in our own backyards. And of course, and I hope you really enjoy Planet Earth as well. I hope if you're tuning in, you probably do. But it can be difficult now when we're kind of socially isolated and quarantining to see this beauty, but it's not too far away. All you have to do is turn on Netflix and look at Planet Earth, and you can see everyone's favorite narrator, David Attenborough, talk about marine iguanas in the Galapagos or clouded leopards in the Himalayas. And you can see all these really exotic places on Earth and the really crazy and really wild diversity of plants and animals across this planet. But you don't have to go really far to see this beauty. You really just have to step into your own backyard. Around where I am in Ottawa right now, it's really early springtime, so there's still a little snow on the ground in some places, and it's just kind of brown and a little gross looking and wet. But in a few weeks, it'll be really beautiful, or even more beautiful, I should say. We'll see carpets of green across the forests, and you'll start to see these little flowers pop up everywhere, these spring ephemerals. Ephemeral means that they disappear really quickly, and these flowers, the first flowers in the springtime, they come up really early in the year, sometimes when there's still snow on the ground, and they disappear within a matter of weeks as well. So they're really beautiful things like trilliums and Solomon seal, and other of these spring ephemerals that will carpet the forest, depending where you are, maybe right now even. And of course, later in the summer, when you walk out into a field or a meadow, you'll see, of course, another kind of huge and beautiful diversity. You know, you'll see a huge bunch of grasses, which look really similar from far away, but when you get up close, you know, two grasses that look really similar can actually be really different. And it's really cool to go up close in these things and see these differences and appreciate that. And of course, you'll see these pockets of beautiful color, things like black-eyed Susans and daisies and other wildflowers across these summer meadows as well. And even in these, you know, more hospitable places, you know, places like our backyards and in southern climates, there we kind of expect things to be beautiful. But even in really remote places like in the far north of Canada and Nunavut, even here in the summertime and at certain times of the year, these places explode with color and beauty. And so this is a part of Nunavut, and even here in the summer, these flowers just carpet the ground with these beautiful colors, and it's really awesome. And in the far north, these things happen, and even in the far south, in deserts, places that we might expect to be completely deserted or devoid of life, they're of course full of hugely cool organisms and beautiful flowers at different times of the year. And so in the last few pictures, I've been showing a lot of plant life and a lot of flowers, and you know, kind of priming up for my talk about pollinators. But in these landscapes, they're not just full of beautiful flowers and things like that. They're also full of animals and different interactions between these animals and plants and other organisms and organisms. And so around here, where I am across most of Canada, you might be familiar with these type of wildlife like moose and bear and rabbits and birds and bees and butterflies. And so that's the kind of examples that I'm going to use here of animals. And as an ecologist, what's interesting to me, especially when it comes to plants and animals, is the interactions between them. And so here in this picture, you can see a few examples of interactions, and I'll point them out. One of them being herbivory, which you're probably really familiar with and you've probably seen happen in real life as well. But it's just, you know, plants or animals eating plants, rabbits chowing down on flowers, or this moose cruising through a field of lupins and eating those as it goes. Other interactions that we can see here that you probably recognize are what's going on here. So in here, we've got a black bear standing over this thicket of flowers of different species. And so all of these flowers are competing against each other. And this competition is really widespread in nature. In this example, you know, nobody goes out in the wild and waters every flower or puts down some topsoil or some nutrients for these. In nature, there's a limited amount of water and resources and sunlight and other things that plants need to grow. And so all of them are going to be competing against each other. It's a free-for-all so that they can get the moisture and the nutrients and sunlight that they need to grow and thrive and reproduce. And so this competition is another really important interaction. And of course, another interaction that's going on in this picture, which isn't super visible, but is happening here and even to us right now, is the interaction between these organisms and their environment. So these abiotic factors, things like temperature and moisture and rainfall, these are interactions that every organism goes through every minute of the day. And as an ecologist who studies climate change, this is something that's really fascinating to me, because these invisible interactions govern how wildlife in the future is going to adapt or be affected by things like climate change, where climate change is changing the environment. So it's changing these interactions for a lot of species. And of course, the final interaction that you can see here, that I'm going to focus on for the rest of this talk, is pollinators. And so you might be familiar with pollination. You might know that bees and butterflies are pollinators and really important for our ecosystems. And in fact, in all of the pictures that I showed before, where we were looking at beautiful environments covered with flowers and landscapes of color and beauty, all of these are supported by pollinators. And without them, a lot of them and a lot of our beautiful planet would kind of fall apart. So pollinators are really important, and I'm going to chat a little bit more about why that is. So you might be familiar with pollination. You might know that it's the transfer of pollen between flowers. And to elaborate on that a little bit more, flowers, to be able to make seeds and reproduce, they need to pollinate themselves. They need to transfer pollen from one part of the flower to another part of the flower. And for most plants, they need to transfer this pollen not just from different parts of the same flower, but to a whole different flower. And so to do that, plants have a few different strategies, and every plant does it a little bit differently. But those strategies to transfer pollen is what we call pollination. And so one really common type of pollination is wind pollination. And so in this type of pollination, plants, they transfer that pollen from one flower to another all by themselves. What they do here is kind of a spray and pray approach. So they create a lot of pollen, they throw it up into the air, they let the wind carry this pollen, and they hope that this pollen lands on another flower of the same species. And that ends up pollinating the flower and creating a seed and allowing that plant to reproduce. And so this is actually really successful. They kind of rely a lot on luck, but if you grab a whole handful of darts and you throw it at a dartboard, one will probably stick, right? So that's the approach that these plants take for self-pollen or for wind pollinating. And you might be familiar with this in a different, more negative type of way if you have seasonal allergies. And so a lot of allergies are caused by inhaling these little pollen grains that are out, especially in the springtime, and irritating our lungs and our sinuses. And so if you have seasonal allergies, and especially now, if you're outside and you're kind of sneezing and coughing quite a bit, then it might be because you're intimately familiar with wind pollinating plants. And you might not appreciate them that much, but they're pretty important. And it's a pretty neat strategy nonetheless. But the other strategy that's a little more important or a little more interesting, at least for me, is animal pollination. So 75 to 90% of flowering plants like wildflowers and other plants, instead of throwing up their pollen and being able to pollinate by themselves, they rely on other animals to transfer this pollen from one flower to the other. And so they rely on bees or butterflies or beetles or flies or moths or bats or birds to transfer this pollen from one flower to another. And this is really important for supporting these natural landscapes, like these pictures that I had shown before. And it's also really important for a lot of the foods that we eat. So about one out of every 3 bites of food that we take is there because of animal pollinators. And especially things like veggies and squash or berries and nuts, a lot of these really colorful foods and the foods that give us a lot of different nutrients and a lot of color on our plates and a lot of the tastiest kind of foods. These are the ones that rely really heavily on animal pollination. So for example, bumblebees, which are really great pollinators, pollinate tomatoes. And so without bumblebees, without pollinators, we wouldn't have tomatoes. And so we would be able to make spaghetti, but we wouldn't have any spaghetti sauce to put on it. And I don't know how you feel about bear noodles, but I'm not a huge fan of it. So I'd like to keep bumblebees around for that. And speaking of bumblebees, I'm going to talk about them a little bit more. This is one of the organisms that I study quite a bit, and they're really the cutest insects of all time. They're really adorable. You've probably seen them, probably quite a bit in the summer. They're really big, they're really fuzzy, they're really loud, so you usually hear them before you actually see them. And they're really gentle as well. They do sting you, so you have to be a little careful, but when you're, as long as you're calm and you're not poking them or being a little too aggressive, then you can get really close to them. You can see them pollinate in real time, in real life, which is really, really cool. And so these bees, because they're so big and they're so fuzzy, they hold warmth really well. And so these are some of the first pollinators that come out in the year. Even sometimes when there's still snow on the ground, these pollinators will be out pollinating those spring ephemerals that I talked about earlier. So they're really important for supporting these really beautiful landscapes that we look at in our own backyard and across a lot of the world. And I'm going to talk about mostly bumblebees for the next little bit, but I also wanted to bring up another pollinator that you might know really well. This pollinator is the honeybee. And often people confuse honeybees and bumblebees, but they're really different. And I'm just going to talk a little bit about how they're different. Honeybees are really cool. They produce honey and they pollinate a lot of other crops that we like to eat. But honeybees aren't native to North America. They don't pollinate a lot of the native wildflowers very well. And in fact, like I said, they're not from here at all. We brought them over from Europe. And so honeybees, in a lot of ways, are really similar to other farm animals like cows or chickens, because we bring them here, we keep them in the hives. They don't live very well outside of the hives. And so honeybees are really cool in their own way. They're really useful for making honey and pollinating crops, but they're much different from the wild pollinators like bumblebees and butterflies and other bees. And so bumblebees have a huge leg up on these honeybees. One of the other really cool things about bumblebees is that they pollinate a really big variety of flowers. Like I said, they pollinate these spring ephemerals because they're out so early in the year. They also stay really late into the fall. And so across the whole summer, different bumblebees can be pollinating a huge variety of different wildflowers and of different crops. And unfortunately, these bumblebees are disappearing. And so some of the most recent research that I've done showed that if you went out to go look for bumblebees now compared to 30 or 40 years ago, you would see about a third less different species of bumblebee. And this is a really big drop in the number of bumblebees that you would see and different species of bumblebees you would see over a really short time period. So it's really concerning, especially for a species that supports so much of the wild ecosystems and landscapes around us. And we know pretty much why they're disappearing. So there are a few question marks still, but in general, we know that the reason they're disappearing has to do with things like pesticides. Pesticides are really useful for crops. They keep all the bad pests away and they allow us to produce a lot of food that we can feed people with. But they end up leaching into the environment a lot, especially when we use a lot of them or we use them a little recklessly. And this contributes to wild pollinators like bumblebees disappearing. Another thing that causes bumblebees to disappear is habitat loss. And so this is like if we take a one of those beautiful summer meadows that I showed earlier, and we were to kind of mow it down and put in a cornfield or a parking lot. And these uses are good. We need corn to eat, and we need parking lots to park our cars. But when we destroy habitat like that, it destroys a lot of the foraging places for bumblebees or nesting places for bumblebees or places that they'll need to hibernate over for the winter. And so this habitat destruction is another really important driver of these disappearances that we see in bumblebees. And another really important driver is climate change. And so you might be pretty familiar with climate change already. You might know that when we do things like drive or heat our houses, we create greenhouse gases like carbon dioxide or methane. And these go into the atmosphere and they end up creating climate change. And you might know that, as a result of climate change, temperatures are getting a little warmer and warmer. So summers are getting warmer and winters are getting a little warmer every year. But the other side of climate change that people don't think about too often is that climate change produces more frequent and more extreme weather events. So things like droughts and heat waves become a lot more frequent and a lot worse with climate change. And on the other end of the spectrum as well, things like flash floods or huge rainfall events also become a lot worse with climate change. So it's these extreme events that climate change makes a lot more frequent and extreme as well. And this is having a big impact on bumblebees, especially when it comes to temperature. And so it looks like when summers start to get really, really hot for long periods of time, or even when winters start to see really warm periods and then really cold periods really quickly, this is really bad for bumblebees. And it's making them disappear across Canada and the United States and Mexico and a lot of Europe as well. And so all of these things, habitat loss and climate change and pesticides, are making for some pretty unhappy bees. But I mentioned I wouldn't just talk about climate change and pollinators. I was also going to mention how you could help save them right now, even once you finish watching this talk. And so one of the ways you can do this is by creating a pollinator garden. And so you can do this in your own backyard or your front yard or on your balcony or your rooftop. But it's pretty easy and it's really helpful for bees and butterflies and other wild pollinators in our landscapes. And so basically a pollinator garden is just creating a garden, and you're going to make sure that you have a lot of flowers, the same type of flowers that you would see if you were to go on a walk in the forest near where you live. So you want to have local wildflowers, things that are really beautiful and really useful and recognizable for these pollinators. And so it creates a resting stop for them, even in the middle of a city, a place where they can forage and get some nectar and do some pollination, and also rest, shelter from the heat or the rain or overwinter for the year. And so creating a garden like this is super useful for wild pollinators. But of course, climate change is one of the big drivers of these declines. And so the only thing we can do to stop that is by being more environmentally friendly and sustainable and conscious of our carbon footprint on a bigger scale. And so we have to do things like recycle and use less water and take the bus and try to drive less often if we want to be able to tackle climate change and reduce this as a cause of declines for bumblebees. And so these are, in some cases pretty easy things, on some cases pretty big things, but they're all things that we can do to help save this beautiful planet that we live on. And as a byproduct or as a bee product of doing all these, we can also make for some really happy bees. So on this note, I'm going to wrap up and thank you for listening. And I'm happy to take any and all questions that you might have related to bees or climate change or science, and I'll try to answer them the best that I can. Thank you.
Fantastic. Well, thank you so much, Peter, for an awesome presentation again. We really appreciate having you back. So yeah, we've got a bunch of people joining in from over on YouTube. So if you're on YouTube, let me know where you're watching in from. Type in your questions. We'll take as many as we can. But I want to begin by saying you highlighted pollinator gardens. And so where can people go to get these flowers, and where do they find out what sort of plants they should be planting nearby?
That's a terrific question. One of the best places to start looking is the internet. There's a lot of resources. Usually if you're living in a city or in some place that has a gardening club or some type of wildlife group or center, then they're really helpful, and they're probably really willing to help you figure out what plants would be best to plant in your garden, depending on what space you have and exactly where you are. So that would be the best place to start looking.
Fantastic. Peter, as adorable as the smiling bee is, if you want to come out of screen share so we can see you again, that would be awesome, man. So Nate from Georgia wants to know, what is the best pollinator plant? Is there some sort of super plant out there that if you have to choose one thing, you should put all over the place, or anything you have to find?
Oh, yeah, that's a great question. And to be honest, I'm not 100% sure. I don't think there's a silver bullet type of plant that you can use. And I don't think it would be necessarily good to plant just one type of plant in a whole garden. It would probably be really useful because plants only flower at a certain time of year. Then it would probably be best to have a diversity of plants. And so instead of having just one period of the summer where there's a lot of pollen and nectar, it's spaced out over time. And so over the whole summer, you have some plants flowering and other plants flowering. That's probably the best route to do.
Yeah. We're doing a session in a few weeks just for that, with regards to that question, on monarch butterflies. So there's an example of something where they have planted one plant in milkweed all across Canada and the US, which is basically because it's the only place that they can actually have their young grow up. But that's a rare scenario. So I'm glad we highlighted that diversity is the key here. All right, we get this question all the time, Peter. What is your favorite part of your job?
That's tough. There's so many good parts. I guess I love catching bees. I spent a summer once, one of the very first summers I was doing research, catching butterflies and catching bees. And so it felt like SpongeBob when he's running after jellyfish with one of the nets. And so it felt really ridiculous, but it was a lot of fun. And it's really cool to be able to catch these organisms and really get a feel for how they live and how they behave. It was really neat, and it really made me feel really connected to kind of these subjects. And it was really fascinating.
Fantastic. Now, so I was the sort of kid that picked up bugs too and like to catch them. For people at home that want to do this, and again, we've got some young kids watching in today, how do they ensure that they don't hurt the bugs when they're doing this? So when we don't want to obviously hurt animals when we're catching them. Is there any tips or tricks that you have?
Yeah, definitely. And especially with bees, you don't want to hurt the animal, and you also don't want to hurt yourself, right? Because they can all sting. Most of them can sting, and so you need to be careful in that sense as well. I would say kind of the best way to do it is, instead of trying to catch them with your hands, try to catch them with your phone. Most phones have great cameras, and so one of the best ways that you can appreciate wildlife, whether it's bugs or butterflies or bees, or even bigger things like deer or moose, is by capturing them on your phone instead, or with a camera. Then you can stay a safe distance away. You can get a beautiful picture and a beautiful experience, and you're much less likely to harm or stress the animal as well.
Yeah, this is actually a sneak peek. This week we're going to be announcing just a game for people at home. Anyone who wants to take pictures of birds or wildlife in their house, share it with us at Exploring by the Seat of Your Pants. We'd love to see what you guys are checking out and finding as flowers are blooming and things are coming back. So check that out. iNaturalist is another great app that you can use, and we've had a lot of conservationists encourage that. So check that out if you can. Carla wants to know, can we collect some seeds from local wildflowers when we're on our walks and use those to plant? So if you see some wildflowers, is there a way to get seeds from them? Should you do that sort of thing? Or what do you think, Peter?
Ooh, that's a good question. That's a really good question. Yeah. I think, for the most part, it's probably best to leave nature where it is. And so that's probably the safest bet. But, take guidance from, other ecologists in your area. If there's ecologist groups or conservation groups, then they're going to know kind of the best bet. What plants are, maybe okay to take seeds from or not okay. But, when you're ever in doubt or in question, leave nature where it is.
Yeah, excellent. I'm always glad when we get that message in. All right, you have traveled a lot. You take some fantastic photos. You've done stuff for research. Is there a favorite place you've been? Is there a place that you would ideally love to go, whether just for photography or for research or anything that jumps out?
Oh man, that's another great question. And I think it's tough because it's so easy to see a lot of beauty everywhere when you're traveling. So even I was taking a walk the other day, just around my house nearby, and I was just like fascinated by like all these little things that I hadn't paid attention to before. But when it comes to like if I had to pick one place, last summer I was in the safari in South Africa, and that was just wild. To wake up and look out and see elephants or lions, just on a daily basis. It was incredible. So I think I might pick that if I had to.
I think even if we just saw your body language there, the enthusiasm shines through. We had a Jane Goodall Institute of Canada on earlier and highlighting how amazing Africa is. So glad we got that brought up. Okay, this is another tough one from Nate. Nate wants to know if you have a favorite pollinator and what it is.
Oh, Nate, that's actually an easy question. It's bumblebees for sure. Bumblebees are just, they're so fuzzy, so adorable, so thick. I mean, I love them. They're incredible.
Awesome. So you're a researcher right now, and you're going to continue doing this work for years to come. Is there a topic within this broader field? I mean, pollination might seem small to us, but there's a lot of research in here. Is there anything specific that you're really fascinated in?
Oh yeah, that's another great question. I think for me, one of the most fascinating avenues of research and what I'm kind of moving into next is looking at how all of these different drivers, there's a lot of things that we know are causing declines in pollinators and in a lot of other wildlife. And these are things that I highlighted, like habitat loss or climate change. And we know individually that all these things have an impact, but what's more difficult to figure out is how these things interact together. So when you have not only habitat being lost, but also climate change making things more extreme, I'm really kind of excited to dig into figuring out how all these interactions work and how we can help make things better for the wildlife that these things are happening to.
Yeah. Now, there must be other people doing this sort of work all over the world. Do you get to work with international collaborators, find out what they're doing with pollinators in Europe and Africa and Asia and more? Or
Yeah,
a little bit of a scientific process.
Yeah, definitely. And I think, going back to that other question about what's my favorite part of this job or the work that I do, it's probably working with all the different people. There are so many passionate people, so many people who are really like just super smart and really clever. And so working with them around the world is another really cool thing to do as part of this. And you get to hear about all sorts of things from, wild dogs in South Africa or, sharks in the oceans. This topic like stretches over such a huge subject matter. And it's really cool to talk to these people working in all these different parts of it.
Yeah. Peter, we're getting close to the end here, believe it or not. So I wanted to stress, is there a place that we can send kids to learn more about the work that you do, about pollinators in general? Any resources you can highlight for kids at home?
Oh, yeah, great question. One great place is Bumblebee Watch is another. You mentioned iNaturalist as a place where people can post photos of animals and cool things that they've seen. For bumblebees and other pollinators, iNaturalist is really great, and Bumblebee Watch is really good as well. And so this is and it has a lot of resources on bumblebees and other pollinators and why they're important and what you can do to save them. So yeah, Bumblebee Watch or Xerxes Society are two really great workshop resources that people can visit. And I can send you those links as well, Jesse.
I am tracking them down right now as we speak, and I'm putting them in the YouTube chat bar. So for anyone at home who wants to check those out, they're a great resource. We're also doing a presentation with Pollinator Partnership, which is across Canada and the US in a few weeks. So we encourage you to check that out as well. I'll try and get all these links there. But yeah, this is fantastic, Peter. Peter, I mean, you gave us a good idea of resources. I mean, what's next for you in pollinator work? What are we to expect from in a couple of years down the road? What are you going to be up to?
Oh, that's a great question. I wish I could tell you, and I'll keep you updated for sure. I have a little bit of time left on my PhD, another year and a bit. So I'm really excited to wrap that up and wrap up a lot of projects related to that, things going on. And as for the next steps, we'll see. Like, I really enjoy conservation, and I really enjoy, feeling like I make an impact on helping species. And so hopefully something along those lines, whether it's research or other type of work, is what I'm aiming for.
Kudos to you. Well, thank you so much for joining us today, Peter. We really, really appreciate it. And thanks so much for sharing all your enthusiasm on pollinators, and especially bumblebees, which we now know are the best insects in the world.
Definitely, yeah. Thank you so much for having me, Jesse. It's a pleasure.
Absolutely. For everyone at home too, thank you so much for tuning in. Check this out. This lives on YouTube. So if you want to watch it again, get a sense, it's a great presentation, and some ideas of what you can do at home. It's all going to be there. And again, we're going to be doing over 100 live free broadcasts in the month of April alone, featuring scientists, explorers, and more. So come check us out. All no registration required. So till then, have a wonderful rest of your day. Bye for now, everyone.